So, picture July of 1988.
Right.
A scheduled, completely civilian passenger flight, this is Iran Air Flight 6755, takes off from Bandar Abbas.
Bound for Dubai, I think.
Exactly,
Yeah.
headed to Dubai. And it's carrying 290 people, including 66 children.
Wow.
Right. And while it's just climbing through Iranian airspace right over the Persian Gulf, the aircraft is targeted, and it is blown completely out of the sky by surface-to-air missiles.
Fired by a U.S. Navy cruiser.
Yeah, the USS Vincennes. Every single soul on board was killed. Now, if you look at, almost any era of human history, an incident of that magnitude...
The military destroying a civilian airliner?
Exactly. That is an immediate, indisputable declaration of absolute war. I mean, you'd expect full military mobilization by the very next morning.
Who really would?
But that didn't happen.
No, it didn't.
The United States president called it a tragic accident, but he reaffirmed the aggressive naval posture in the region. There was no formal apology at the time. And the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, he called it premeditated murder. He demanded his people prepare for an apocalyptic showdown.
The rhetoric was just blood-curdling.
Totally blood-curdling. Yet the armies never marched. The missiles stayed in their silos. The total war that seemed completely inevitable, it just vanished into this simmering, deeply toxic standoff.
Yeah, and that specific event is, well, it's the perfect lens through which to view the last 40 years of geopolitical maneuvering in the Middle East.
How so?
Well, it reveals this highly counterintuitive reality. Beneath all the fiery, apocalyptic rhetoric that defines the relationship between Washington and Tehran, there's a really cold, calculating, and profound restraint.
Like a mutual hesitation.
Exactly. Neither state has ever found it in their ultimate strategic interest to actually initiate a direct hot war.
Which brings us to our mission for today, because today we are doing a deep dive into an absolute mountain of source material.
So much material.
Yeah. We've got declassified histories, economic data, these deep diplomatic analyses, all of it charting Iran's really complex web of global relations over the last 4 decades.
And, the central thesis that emerges from all this data is that Iran's foreign policy is not erratic.
Right. It's not just random.
No, it doesn't exist in a vacuum at all. It is almost entirely a reaction to and shaped by the immense gravitational pull of its 4-decade Cold War with the United States.
Okay, but before we go any further, I really want to establish a very clear framework for you, the listener, on how we're going to navigate this deep dive.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Because we are unpacking decades of dense, heavily politicized history. These are nations that view each other as existential threats.
Truly existential.
So as your guides through this material, neither of us will be taking political sides today. We aren't endorsing ideologies, and we definitely aren't passing moral judgments.
Oh, that is fundamentally not our mission here.
Exactly. We are here to look at the geopolitical chessboard completely objectively. We're going to analyze the strategic moves, the economic levers, and the historical traumas that drive these nations.
Strictly based on the provided source material.
Right. We want to help you understand the actual mechanics of how this part of the world functions behind the headlines.
And that chessboard is remarkably complex. When you analyze a state operating under the kind of intense, suffocating international pressure that Iran faces, you begin to see a foreign policy that is deeply bifurcated.
Bifurcated how? Like split in two?
Yeah, exactly. The sources trace this all the way back to the foundational architecture established by Ayatollah Khomeini right after the 1979 revolution. The literature describes it as a two-pronged approach, which is essentially an institutionalized paradox. On one side, the state projects this rigid ideological jihadi resistance toward perceived adversaries.
So primarily directed at the United States and Israel.
Right. And this prong is vital for the regime's internal legitimacy. It's a revolutionary fire that, justifies the system's very existence.
Got it. What's the second prong?
Well, running parallel to that, often in total contradiction, is a highly pragmatic, incredibly flexible pursuit of transactional relationships.
Meaning with powers like Russia, China, India, the EU.
Exactly.
I really want to focus on that paradox for a second because, it sounds completely unworkable on paper.
It does.
To put it in perspective for you listening, it is essentially like watching a nation play 2 entirely different board games at the exact same time, on the exact same table.
Oh, that's a great way to think about it.
Right. Like with the United States, they are playing this relentless game of risk. It's highly ideological. It's all about borders, proxy armies, absolute regime survival.
There's zero middle ground there.
Exactly.
Right.
But then you pivot to their dealings with Russia or China, and suddenly they're playing a highly pragmatic game of monopoly.
Yeah, bartering over oil futures, negotiating pipeline routes.
Right, buying infrastructure and just totally ignoring ideological differences. So my question is, how does a single government maintain that level of cognitive dissonance without just collapsing in on itself?
Well, the answer lies in the internal architecture of the country. Iran's domestic political system is not a monolith.
It's not just one guy making all the calls.
No, it's heavily factionalized, and it's intentionally designed to balance competing interests.
Okay, break that down for us.
So on one side, you have the unelected clerical leadership and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. They are the vanguard of the revolution.
Right, their mandate is to preserve the ideological purity of 1979.
Exactly. And to do that, they control the military, the intelligence apparatus, and these massive sectors of the domestic economy.
Okay, so that's the risk players.
Yeah. But then, on the other side, you have the elected parliament, the presidency, and this vast network of technocrats and diplomats.
And what's their job?
Their mandate is to manage the daily realities of a modern nation-state of 80 million people. They have to curb inflation, secure trade routes, manage water crises.
Attract foreign investment.
Exactly.
Which creates this wild environment where, like, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs might be trying to negotiate a super delicate multilateral trade agreement in Europe.
Right.
While simultaneously, the IRGC is publicly testing ballistic missiles, or they're funding a proxy militia in a way that completely undermines that very trade agreement.
Yeah, it's like trying to close a massive corporate merger while half your executive board is actively trying to sabotage the corporate headquarters to protest capitalism.
That is wild. That is the daily reality of their diplomatic corps.
Yeah.
But to understand why Tehran desperately needs these pragmatic transactional relationships in the East, we have to look at the conflict that isolated them in the first place.
Right. The defining element of modern Iranian foreign policy is the U.S. Iran conundrum.
The big Cold War.
Yeah. The source texts detail a relationship that is defined by total mutual demonization. Both sides operate from deeply entrenched threat perceptions.
Okay, let's look at how they see each other from Iran's perspective.
From the perspective of the Islamic Republic, the United States is an arrogant, hegemonic empire, and they believe its ultimate unstated goal is regime change and the destruction of Iranian sovereignty.
And from the perspective of Washington,
Iran is a destabilizing theocracy, the world's premier state sponsor of terrorism, and a direct menace to American interests and allies across the Middle East.
and this conflict isn't just, a general animosity. The research breaks it down into 4 distinct structural pillars.
Yeah, these pillars act as the walls of this diplomatic prison.
So let's walk through those structural pillars because they really dictate everything else we're going to discuss today. The first pillar is the nuclear program.
Right, which became a massive issue.
Yeah, it really began dominating the geopolitical landscape in the 1990s. But the historical irony embedded here is profound.
Oh, it really is.
Because the foundation of Iran's nuclear infrastructure was actually built in the 1950s and 60s under the rule of the Shah.
Mohammad Reza Pahlavi.
Exactly. And it was built with the direct endorsement, the funding, and the technical assistance of the United States.
Under the Atoms for Peace program, Washington literally gave Tehran its first research reactor.
Wait, really? The U.S. gave them their first reactor?
Yeah. But then after the 1979 revolution, when a pro-Western monarch was replaced by a fiercely anti-American theocracy, the U.S. calculation shifted instantly.
I mean, that makes sense. The technology didn't change, but the intent behind it was suddenly perceived as an existential threat.
Exactly, which led to massive efforts by the U.S. to curb their proliferation.
Okay, so that's the first pillar. What's the second?
The second pillar revolves around Iran's asymmetric military doctrine, specifically its support for subnational groups.
Proxies, basically.
Right. The sources detail an extensive network. We're talking about Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthi movement in Yemen.
And the U.S. views these groups as a massive problem.
Oh, absolutely. The United States and its regional allies classify these groups as terrorist organizations. They view Tehran's financial and military backing of them as a deliberate strategy to destabilize sovereign nations.
And to threaten U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf.
Right. But Iran, conversely, views this network as its axis of resistance.
Because they don't have a conventional military that can compete. Right.
Exactly. Lacking a conventional air force or navy that could ever go toe-to-toe with the United States, Tehran relies on these subnational groups as a strategic forward defense.
So it's a way to deter attacks by keeping conflicts far away from its own borders.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the third pillar, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
This is a huge one. Iran and Israel view one another as absolute, uncompromising existential threats.
Right. The Islamic Republic's ideology fundamentally rejects the existence of Israel.
And they point to unconditionally strong U.S. military and diplomatic support for Israel as undeniable proof of an imperialist design to subjugate the Middle East.
Meanwhile, the U.S. views Iran's funding of anti-Israel militias and just its hostile rhetoric in general as the single greatest roadblock to any viable peace process in the Levant.
Exactly. It's a total gridlock.
Okay, so that leaves the fourth pillar, human rights and internal governance.
Right. Successive U.S. administrations have consistently condemned the Iranian government's crackdowns on internal dissent.
Like the Green Movement.
Yes, the violent suppression of the 2009 Green Movement, where millions of Iranians protested disputed election results. That is frequently cited in the sources.
As a turning point.
Yeah, as a watershed moment that really solidified Washington's view that the regime is just fundamentally incompatible with universal human rights.
But Tehran completely rejects this framework.
Totally. They view American rhetoric on democracy as hypocritical.
Because of U.S. alliances with various authoritarian states in the region.
Right. They interpret it as a thinly veiled mechanism for inciting internal rebellion.
Now, I want to dig into that fourth pillar for a second. Because the source material brings up a really specific policy example that is incredibly revealing about how actions in Washington actually reverberate on the ground in Tehran.
You're talking about the 2006 fund.
Yes. In 2006, the George W. Bush administration created something called the Iran Democracy Fund.
Right.
And the stated objective, which was backed by tens of millions of dollars in congressional appropriations, was to support civil society groups, human rights activists, and pro-democracy NGOs operating inside Iran.
Which sounds great, right?
Right. On the surface, if you are a policymaker in D.C., that sounds like a noble, supportive initiative. But let's look at the actual mechanics of implementation.
Yeah, how it played out.
If you openly allocate millions of dollars to fund opposition groups in a hostile state, do you actually empower those activists, or do you essentially paint a giant neon target on their backs?
Well, the outcomes documented in the research point overwhelmingly to the latter. The creation of that fund resulted in massive, unintended blowback for the very people it was designed to help.
How bad was it?
Very bad. Prominent Iranian civil society leaders, human rights lawyers, journalists, they publicly pleaded with the U.S. to stop the funding.
Wait, they asked them to stop sending money?
Yes, because they argued that American money tainted their domestic legitimacy.
Oh, I see.
In the eyes of the Iranian intelligence services, accepting U.S. funds transformed these activists from domestic political dissidents into foreign agents engaged in espionage.
It gave the regime the perfect legal and PR pretext to just crush them.
Exactly, under the banner of national security.
Because you have to look at the psychological framing here. In the context of Iranian history, democracy promotion from the West is not interpreted as a benevolent humanitarian gesture.
No, it is a trigger warning for a coup.
And to understand why that trigger is so incredibly sensitive, we have to wind the clock back to 1953.
The Mossadegh coup.
Right. The CIA, in collaboration with British intelligence, actively orchestrated a coup d'etat that overthrew Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh.
After he attempted to nationalize the country's oil industry.
Exactly. And they reinstated the Shah, an autocrat who ruled with a brutal secret police force for the next quarter century.
And that historical trauma is literally baked into the institutional DNA of the Islamic Republic.
So when the U.S. State Department announces a fund to promote democratic change, the Iranian leadership doesn't see a grant program.
No, they see the 1953 playbook being opened again. They see a Trojan horse.
Consequently, Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security rapidly labeled over 60 international media organizations, think tanks, and NGOs as soft war agents.
Making it a severe criminal offense for any Iranian citizen to even interact with them.
Wow. Okay, so you have these four massive load-bearing pillars of conflict: the nuclear fears, the proxy networks, the Israel antagonism, and the human rights disputes.
And for decades, this created total diplomatic gridlock.
Right. The George W. Bush administration's policy of aggressive containment and labeling Iran part of the axis of evil failed to curb their nuclear ambitions.
And on the other side, attempts by the reformist Iranian President Mohammad Khatami in the late 1990s and early 2000s to initiate a dialogue among civilizations
Right.
failed to gain any traction.
Due to deep-seated mistrust in Washington and sabotage by hardliners at home.
It was a complete stalemate.
So the question then becomes, how do two nations with such deeply entrenched structural animosity finally end up sitting across from each other at a negotiating table?
Well, it required a highly improbable historic convergence of domestic crises and shifting global priorities.
Okay, lay that out for us.
We basically saw two relatively conciliatory leaders, Hassan Rouhani in Iran and Barack Obama in the United States, come to power at the same time. And both possessed overwhelming urgent incentives to break the 40-year freeze.
To understand this, we need to analyze the specific pressures driving each side, starting with the devastating economic reality inside Iran at the time.
Yeah, the economic squeeze that Iran was experiencing by 2012 cannot be overstated. It was absolutely brutal.
Because the United States and the European Union, in this really rare display of total alignment, implemented a sanctions regime of unprecedented severity.
Right. They imposed a comprehensive embargo on Iranian oil exports, which was the lifeblood of the country's budget.
But more importantly, they targeted the financial plumbing of the global economy. They orchestrated the removal of Iranian banks from the SWIFT network.
And this is huge.
It is huge. Now, we hear the term SWIFT a lot in the news, but it is crucial to understand the mechanics of what it actually is.
Yeah, explain that for the listener.
SWIFT is not a bank. It is a secure, neutral messaging system based in Belgium that banks use to authorize international transfers.
Right.
If you are disconnected from SWIFT, it doesn't matter how much money you have sitting in a vault. You have no mechanism to move it across borders. You are financially excommunicated.
And the resulting data points illustrate the speed and scale of that devastation.
What do the numbers look like?
Between July 2011 and July 2012, Iran's oil revenues were cut in half. They plummeted from roughly $5.8 billion a month to $2.9 billion.
Cut in half in 12 months.
Yes. And this wasn't just a recession. It triggered a 9% contraction of their entire gross domestic product in a single year.
Ouch.
The national currency, the rial, went into free fall, causing hyperinflation. Basic goods, medicine, food staples, they all became prohibitively expensive for the average citizen.
Even Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president at the time, accurately described it as the heaviest economic onslaught on a nation in modern history.
Which brings us to Hassan Rouhani, who was elected president in 2013 on a very specific, desperate mandate.
Stop the bleeding.
Exactly. He promised the electorate he would fix the economy. But everyone in the power structure knew that economic recovery was mathematically impossible without the lifting of international sanctions.
And this created a profound existential panic at the very top of the regime.
Yeah, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who holds ultimate authority, was reportedly terrified of a domestic uprising.
He remembered the millions in the streets during the 2009 Green Movement.
Right. If the economy completely collapsed under the weight of hyperinflation and mass unemployment, the ensuing riots wouldn't just be about disputed ballots.
They would be driven by starvation.
And they could easily topple the entire Islamic Republic. Regime survival, the ultimate imperative, now required a negotiated settlement.
Okay, so that explains why Iran wanted a deal. But an agreement requires a willing partner. Why was the United States, operating from a position of massive economic leverage, willing to sit down?
The source texts indicate a profound shift in American strategic thinking, driven by fatigue and changing regional dynamics.
By the second term of the Obama administration, the limits of American military intervention in the Middle East were painfully obvious.
Very obvious. The invasions and subsequent occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan had cost trillions of dollars. They resulted in thousands of American casualties, and they failed to produce stable, democratic allies.
The U.S. public was exhausted.
Completely exhausted. Furthermore, the messy fallout of Western intervention in Libya, the chaotic results of the Arab Spring.
And the failure to enforce the red line regarding chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war.
Exactly. All of that had severely degraded Washington's appetite for new military entanglements.
And then the landscape of the Middle East had also fundamentally fractured with the sudden, explosive rise of ISIS.
This is a crucial piece of the puzzle.
You have this radical, apocalyptic Sunni extremist organization rapidly conquering massive territories in Iraq and Syria, beheading journalists, declaring a caliphate.
And this created an incredibly bizarre geopolitical reality.
Right, because ISIS viewed the Shia-majority government of Iran as apostates who needed to be exterminated. So they represented a massive direct security threat to Tehran's borders.
Simultaneously, ISIS was plotting terror attacks against the West, representing a top-tier national security threat to the United States.
So in theaters like Iraq, the U.S. Air Force and Iranian-backed ground militias commanded by Qasem Soleimani were effectively fighting the exact same enemy.
They found themselves forced into an unspoken, highly uncomfortable alignment of interests.
And beyond the immediate threat of terrorism, the Obama administration was trying to execute a massive grand strategy known as the pivot to Asia.
Right, a reallocation of military and diplomatic resources designed to counter the historic rise of China.
And it is worth noting, this broader strategic shift was largely continued by subsequent administrations, regardless of party affiliation.
Yeah, but you cannot pivot your military and diplomatic focus to the Pacific if you are constantly bogged down managing crises in the Persian Gulf.
The U.S. needed to extricate itself from the Middle East, and the administration realized that stabilizing the region without engaging its largest, most influential power, Iran, was an impossible task.
There was also a significant economic argument being made in Western capitals at the time.
Right, about the Iranian market.
Yeah. It is a common misconception to view Iran simply as a giant gas station, just a monolithic petrostate.
But the research points out that their economy is surprisingly diverse.
It is. Oil revenues only accounted for roughly 15% of Iran's GDP at the time.
Wow, really?
Oh.
Only 15%?
Yeah. If you compare that to a state like Saudi Arabia, where oil accounts for nearly half the GDP, the difference is stark.
So what makes up the rest of it?
Well, Iran has a highly educated, deeply urbanized, diverse population of roughly 80 million people. They have massive automotive, agricultural, and manufacturing sectors.
So for European and American multinational corporations, reintegrating an untapped market of 80 million consumers into the global economy offered billions of dollars in potential contracts.
Exactly. This creates a scenario where both sides, driven by entirely different internal logic, arrived at the exact same conclusion.
The Iranians needed to stop the economic strangulation to prevent a domestic revolution, and the Americans needed a diplomatic victory to secure their regional exit strategy.
And prevent another Middle Eastern war.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of two rival ships caught in a massive hurricane.
I like this analogy.
Right. The captains despise each other. They have been firing cannons at each other for decades. But right now, their respective hulls are taking on water fast.
Yeah.
They realize that if they don't temporarily stop shooting and help each other pump the water out, both ships are going to the bottom of the ocean.
The motivation is pure, unadulterated survival.
But wanting a deal and executing a deal are two wildly different things. Translating that mutual exhaustion into a highly technical, legally binding agreement involving nuclear physics and global finance is a staggering logistical challenge.
Which brings us to the architecture of the deal itself, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA.
The diplomatic process was painstaking.
It really was. It began with highly classified secret back-channel talks facilitated by the Sultan of Oman in Muscat.
These secret meetings laid the groundwork for a public breakthrough. In September 2013, as President Rouhani was leaving the United Nations General Assembly in New York, he took a phone call from President Obama.
And that single phone conversation broke a profound 30-year taboo. It was the highest-level direct contact between the two nations since the hostage crisis in 1979.
That momentum led to an interim agreement, and ultimately, after years of grueling negotiations in Vienna hotels, the landmark 2015 JCPOA was signed.
Let's break down the actual mechanics of this agreement, because the technical concessions are incredibly specific.
Yeah, if we look at what Iran gave up, it is a masterclass in nuclear dismantlement.
Walk us through the physics of it.
So the physics of nuclear weapons require highly enriched fissile material. Naturally occurring uranium is mostly the isotope U-238, which is stable.
Right.
To make a bomb, you need a high concentration of the isotope U-235. Iran agreed to reduce its massive stockpile of enriched uranium from 7,500 kilograms down to a mere 300 kilograms.
That's a huge drop.
Massive. Furthermore, they legally bound themselves to enrich uranium to a maximum purity of 3.67%.
And why is that number significant?
That level of enrichment is perfectly fine if you want to boil water to run a civilian nuclear power plant. But it is completely useless for building a weapon, which requires enrichment levels upwards of 90%.
I see. They also agreed to fundamentally dismantle the physical machinery used to enrich that uranium.
The centrifuges.
Right. To separate those isotopes, uranium gas is spun at supersonic speeds inside tall cylindrical machines called centrifuges. Iran agreed to slash its number of functioning centrifuges from roughly 19,000 down to just over 5,000.
And they were restricted to using only their oldest, least efficient first-generation IR-1 models.
Exactly. But, uranium enrichment isn't the only way to build a nuclear weapon. You can also use weapons-grade plutonium, which is a byproduct of certain types of nuclear reactors.
And how did they close off that pathway?
Iran agreed to redesign and rebuild its heavy water research reactor at the Iraq facility.
The source material mentions something wild about this.
Yeah, in a highly visceral, symbolic act of compliance, they literally poured solid concrete into the core of the original reactor.
Wait, they just filled it with concrete.
Filled it with concrete, rendering it permanently inoperable.
That is quite the statement. So, in exchange for dismantling the physical infrastructure of their nuclear ambitions, the concessions they extracted from the West were monumental.
What did they get?
The United Nations, the European Union, and the United States agreed to lift all nuclear-related economic and financial sanctions.
Meaning immediate cash.
Exactly. This meant immediately unfreezing tens of billions of dollars in Iranian assets that had been trapped in overseas bank accounts.
And lifting the oil embargo.
Right, allowing Iran to sell its crude on the open market. And most critically, it meant reintegrating the Iranian central bank and its financial institutions back into the SWIFT network, restoring their ability to conduct global commerce.
But the central dilemma of the JCPOA was always the issue of trust.
Of course. You have a legally binding agreement between two entities that fundamentally view each other as deceitful adversaries.
So the entire architecture of the deal relied on unprecedented verification mechanisms managed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA.
Right. Proponents of the deal pointed to the implementation of the additional protocol.
And what did that protocol actually allow?
It was a sweeping set of verification tools. It allowed IAEA inspectors continuous electronic monitoring of nuclear facilities, the ability to track the entire supply chain of uranium from a mine to the centrifuge.
Wow, from the mine itself.
Yeah. And the authority to conduct short-notice inspections and environmental swabbing to detect microscopic traces of illicit nuclear material.
And the core argument from Washington was that these mechanisms extended Iran's breakout time.
Breakout time being the theoretical time it would take to produce enough fissile material for one weapon if they decided to violate the agreement.
Right. They extended that time from a terrifying 2 months to over a year.
Which provided the international community a massive window to detect cheating and respond militarily if necessary.
But despite the science, the political backlash to this agreement was absolutely ferocious. And it acted like a mirror image of outrage in both capitals.
Let's start with Tehran.
In Tehran, the hardline factions, the clerics, and the IRGC leadership were enraged. They viewed the JCPOA as a disastrous capitulation.
Because they felt they gave up too much.
Yeah, they argued that the moderate Rouhani government had surrendered Iran's most potent strategic leverage, its nuclear infrastructure, in exchange for fragile, easily reversible Western promises.
And they genuinely feared the influx of Western business and inspectors was a Trojan horse designed to dilute the revolutionary culture and orchestrate a soft regime change.
Meanwhile, the reaction in Washington was equally polarized.
Oh, absolutely. The Republican Party in the U.S. Congress was virtually unanimous in its opposition.
And what were their main criticisms?
The criticisms focused heavily on the sunset clauses. Certain restrictions on Iran's enrichment capacity and centrifuge research were designed to expire after 10 to 15 years. So critics argued this didn't permanently block Iran's path to a bomb. It merely hit the pause button,
allowing them to eventually emerge from the agreement as an economically wealthy, internationally legitimized threshold nuclear state.
Exactly. Furthermore, critics demanded that inspectors have unrestricted access to highly sensitive conventional military sites, such as the Parchin complex, where intelligence suggested historical weaponization-related research had occurred.
And regional allies were furious too, right?
Yes, particularly Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He vehemently lobbied against the deal, warning that the billions in unfrozen assets wouldn't be used to build schools in Tehran,
but would be funneled directly into Hezbollah and Hamas to expand Iran's proxy wars.
And this political polarization created a massive immediate problem for the actual functional mechanics of the deal.
Because of the snapback provision.
Right. The legal text of the agreement included a mechanism known as the snapback provision. This was designed as an insurance policy.
How did it work?
It stipulated that if any party to the agreement formally accused Iran of violating the terms, all the crippling United Nations sanctions would instantly snap back into place automatically.
Without the possibility of a veto from Russia or China at the Security Council.
Exactly.
Now, the snapback provision, while politically necessary to sell the deal in Washington, acted as a lethal poison pill for the Iranian economy.
Explain that, because it's a fascinating dynamic.
Well, imagine the scenario from the perspective of a compliance officer at a massive European or Asian multinational bank. You are looking at facilitating a $10 billion infrastructure project to modernize Iran's energy grid.
Okay, sounds lucrative.
It does. But you know that at any moment, a political dispute over a minor technicality could trigger that snapback provision.
And overnight, your massive investment becomes illegal.
Exactly. Exposing your bank to catastrophic, multi-billion-dollar fines for the U.S. Treasury Department. The risk matrix simply did not make sense.
As a result, the promised economic windfall never truly materialized for the average Iranian. The major international banks engaged in massive overcompliance.
They simply refused to process Iranian transactions out of fear of U.S. prosecution.
Right. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif publicly complained that the U.S. Treasury was actively intimidating global financial institutions, issuing pages of vague warnings and caveats that created a de facto psychological embargo, even though the legal sanctions were technically lifted.
Then the geopolitical landscape suffered a seismic shift with the election of Donald Trump.
Right, because he had campaigned relentlessly on tearing up the JCPOA, characterizing it as the worst diplomatic agreement in American history.
And once in office, his administration adopted a strategy of maximum pressure.
Tensions escalated rapidly when Iran conducted a series of ballistic missile tests.
Now, technically, the JCPOA did not strictly forbid these tests.
Right. A related UN resolution merely called upon Iran not to undertake activity related to missiles designed to carry nuclear weapons.
However, the Trump administration viewed these tests as a hostile provocation, infamously putting Iran on notice via social media.
The downward spiral was breathtakingly fast. The Trump administration began unilaterally imposing new, non-nuclear sanctions on Iranian individuals, companies, and the IRGC.
And meanwhile, the IAEA, the agency responsible for verifying the deal, released consecutive quarterly reports explicitly confirming that Iran was fully complying with every technical nuclear limitation stipulated in the agreement.
But the U.S. administration argued that Iran's ballistic missile program and its expanding proxy wars in Syria and Yemen violated the spirit of the deal.
Ultimately, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, reinstating all primary and secondary economic sanctions.
Put yourself in the position of the Iranian leadership in that moment. You just spent years exhausting immense domestic political capital to negotiate the most significant diplomatic agreement in your modern history.
You poured concrete into your heavy water reactor.
You dismantled thousands of centrifuges. You allowed unprecedented inspections.
There's a
The Western banking system was too terrified to do business with you anyway, and the new American president just tore up the agreement and reinstated the embargo.
So the lesson the regime internalized was absolute. The West is fundamentally untrustworthy. Economic integration with the United States and its financial system is a vulnerability, not an asset.
Recognizing that the door to the West was firmly, perhaps permanently closed, Tehran realized it had to pivot its entire survival strategy.
It had to look north, and it had to look east.
Which brings us to the complex, deeply cynical relationship between Iran and the Russian Federation.
The source material refers to this alignment as a wary engagement, or a marriage of convenience.
And that terminology is vital, because if you only read current headlines about Iranian drones in Ukraine or joint naval drills, you might assume these two nations are steadfast, ideological brothers in arms.
But beneath the surface, the history between Moscow and Tehran is defined by centuries of profound trauma, betrayal, and deep-seated paranoia.
The historical baggage is staggering. Let's look back. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Russian Empire aggressively expanded southward, repeatedly engaging in brutal wars against the Persian Empire.
Right. The treaties of Gulistan and Turkmenchay forced Iran to cede massive, culturally significant territories in the Caucasus.
Areas that comprise modern-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan directly to Russian control.
And the trauma continued into the 20th century. During World War II, despite Iran declaring neutrality, the Soviet Union and Great Britain jointly invaded and occupied the country to secure oil fields and supply lines.
And when the war ended, the Soviet Union explicitly violated its treaty obligations by refusing to withdraw its troops from northern Iran.
Attempting to establish puppet separatist states, which sparked one of the first major crises of the Cold War.
And of course, the 1979 Soviet invasion of neighboring Afghanistan terrified the newly established Islamic Republic, which genuinely feared that the Red Army might continue its march south toward the warm water ports of the Persian Gulf.
Given that history, you can understand why the Iranian public views Russian intentions with intense suspicion.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of being forced to sign a long-term lease with a roommate who has repeatedly broken into your room, stolen your property, and threatened your life.
You don't trust them for a second.
You sleep with one eye open.
Mm.
But you are currently facing eviction by a massive neighborhood bully, the United States.
So you desperately need to split the rent, and you need someone heavily armed to help you guard the front door.
The alliance is driven by immediate, unvarnished necessity, not trust.
And the catalyst that truly transformed this historic animosity into a functional, strategic military axis was the Syrian civil war.
Right. In Syria, Moscow and Tehran discovered an absolute alignment of immediate interests, the preservation of the Bashar al-Assad regime.
For Russia, maintaining Assad in power was a non-negotiable strategic imperative. Syria hosts Russia's naval facility at Tartus and the Khmeimim Air Base in Latakia.
These are Moscow's only military footholds in the Middle East, right?
Yes, and its primary projection of power into the Mediterranean Sea. Losing Assad meant losing their geopolitical relevance in the region.
Now, for Iran, the stakes in Syria were equally existential, but for different reasons. Syria is the geographic, logistical bridge that connects Tehran to its most powerful proxy army, Hezbollah, in Lebanon.
If the Assad regime fell to Western-backed rebels or radical Sunni extremist groups, that supply line would be permanently severed,
fundamentally castrating Iran's forward defense strategy against Israel. Both Russia and Iran looked at the map and realized that if they didn't coordinate their military efforts, the U.S. and its Gulf allies would dictate the future of the Middle East.
Furthermore, the research details how Russia is driven by profound domestic security fears regarding Islamic extremism.
Chechnya.
Exactly. Moscow fought 2 devastating wars in Chechnya and continues to manage a volatile insurgency in its North Caucasus region.
And during the rise of ISIS, thousands of radicalized Muslims from Chechnya and former Soviet Central Asian republics traveled to Syria to join the caliphate.
So the Kremlin's strategic calculus was ruthless. It was far better to deploy the Russian Air Force to bomb these Russian-speaking extremists in the deserts of Syria, alongside Iranian-backed ground militias, than to wait for those battle-hardened terrorists to return home and carry out attacks in the Moscow subway system.
So Russia relies on Iran's Shia militias as a necessary, brutal bulwark against the spread of radical Sunni terrorism toward its southern borders.
We also see this marriage of convenience operating in the Caspian Sea, which is a fascinating case study in mutual interest overriding international norms.
Oh, the Caspian Basin is incredibly resource-rich, holding massive reserves of untapped oil and natural gas.
And for decades, the legal status of the Caspian was disputed. But by carefully refusing to legally classify the body of water as a traditional sea,
which would subject it to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Right. Russia and Iran engineered a bespoke legal framework. They established an agreement stating that only the 5 nations bordering the Caspian are legally permitted to deploy military vessels in its waters.
So in one diplomatic stroke, they erected an impenetrable legal barrier that permanently bans the United States Navy or NATO forces from ever sailing into a highly strategic waterway.
That Caspian agreement also highlights another layer of Russian pragmatism. By controlling the legal framework of the basin, Russia effectively holds a veto over the construction of subsea pipelines.
Meaning they can stop nations like Turkmenistan from building direct gas pipelines across the Caspian to supply European markets,
ensuring that Russia maintains its lucrative, monopolistic grip on European energy leverage.
Add to this the fact that Russia has acted as Iran's primary supplier of advanced weaponry, notably defying Western pressure to deliver the sophisticated S-300 surface-to-air missile defense system, and you see the architecture of a formidable alliance.
But if we examine the source material closely, significant fundamental fractures in this relationship become really obvious.
Right. The assumption that Russia operates as a loyal partner in Iran's axis of resistance is entirely false.
Russia views itself as a global superpower. Its strategic goals are vast and multidirectional. It wants international prestige, stable global energy prices, and leverage over the West.
Its interests in the Middle East are about maximizing its own influence, not fighting Iran's ideological battles.
And the evidence of this is how aggressively Russia plays all sides of the regional chessboard, often directly undermining Iranian interests.
Let's look at Israel for a second. While Iran funds proxy armies and deploys personnel in Syria with the explicit ideological goal of confronting the Israeli state, the Russian military operates a highly functional, direct deconfliction hotline with the Israeli Defense Forces.
It's wild. When Israeli fighter jets enter Syrian airspace to bomb Iranian military convoys or weapons depots destined for Hezbollah, the Russian air defense systems stationed in Syria remarkably stand down.
Russian President Vladimir Putin and Israeli leadership have held numerous urgent summits to ensure their military operations do not interfere with one another. Moscow is effectively turning a blind eye while Israel degrades Iran's military infrastructure.
And the diplomatic whiplash doesn't stop with Israel. Look at Saudi Arabia, which is Iran's bitterest sectarian and geopolitical rival in the region.
Rather than isolating Riyadh to support Tehran, Putin has aggressively courted Saudi leadership.
He has hosted King Salman with massive fanfare in Moscow, negotiating multi-billion-dollar arms sales, and, critically, establishing the OPEC Plus framework to coordinate global oil production quotas.
Russia is perfectly willing to partner with Iran's sworn enemies if it benefits the Russian economy.
This duplicity is not lost on the Iranian public or its political elite. The deep-seated domestic mistrust of Russian intentions occasionally boils over into public outrage.
The research highlights a specific incident in 2016 that perfectly illustrates this volatility.
The Hamadan Air Base.
Yes, the Iranian government, acting out of military necessity, quietly brokered a deal that allowed Russian Tupolev strategic bombers to utilize the Hamadan Air Base in western Iran to launch devastating bombing runs into Syria.
Now, you have to understand the constitutional context here. The Iranian constitution, born out of the anti-imperialist fervor of the 1979 revolution, explicitly forbids the establishment of any foreign military bases on Iranian soil.
So when the Russian Ministry of Defense proudly published photos of their bombers operating out of Hamadan, the Iranian public and members of the parliament were absolutely furious.
The optics were disastrous. It looked like the regime was surrendering national sovereignty to a historic imperial oppressor.
The domestic blowback was so intense, so politically toxic, that the Iranian Defense Ministry was forced to publicly rebuke Moscow for its show-off attitude and abruptly revoke Russia's access to the base after just 1 week.
That incident underscores the structural limitation of the Russo-Iranian axis. It is a cynical, tactical military coordination born of necessity, fraught with historical suspicion, and limited by Russia's desire to maintain lucrative relationships with Iran's regional adversaries.
So, if your military ally in the north is fundamentally untrustworthy and politically toxic at home, and the Western financial system is completely locked behind a wall of sanctions, where does a nation of 80 million people turn for basic economic survival?
They turn to the east. They turn to the absolute economic juggernaut that is the People's Republic of China.
The Sino-Iranian relationship operates on a completely different frequency than the Russian alliance.
It is devoid of religious ideology, it is free from the historical trauma of 19th century imperialism, and it is largely unconcerned with the nuances of Middle Eastern proxy wars.
It is fundamentally ruthlessly transactional, and it is driven by one primary commodity: energy.
China's domestic economic miracle requires staggering, uninterrupted inputs of energy. China imports roughly half of all the oil it consumes, and traditionally over 50% of those imports originate in the Middle East.
For decades, Iran served as a cornerstone of China's energy security strategy, consistently ranking among its top 3 suppliers.
Even when the crippling international sanctions of 2012 forced China to artificially throttle back its purchases, dropping Iran to its 6th largest supplier, the sheer volume of the exchange remained colossal.
By 2016, bilateral trade between the two nations exceeded $31 billion annually.
And this transactional lifeline has deep roots. During the 1980s, when Iran was fighting a horrific, grinding 8-year war of attrition against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the newly established Islamic Republic found itself under a total Western arms embargo.
It was China that stepped into the void. Beijing provided Tehran with billions of dollars in critical military hardware.
Most notably, the Silkworm anti-ship missiles, which allowed Iran to threaten the strategic choke point of the Strait of Hormuz.
More importantly, Chinese engineers laid the foundation for Iran's domestic defense industry, providing the crucial technical assistance that jump-started both their ballistic missile program and their early nuclear research infrastructure.
In exchange for providing this vital geopolitical lifeline, China extracted massive long-term economic concessions.
Right. By acting as the buyer of last resort for sanctioned Iranian crude, China secures a massive locked-in market for its own state-owned enterprises.
When Western engineering firms like Total or Siemens were forced to abandon multi-billion-dollar contracts to modernize Iran's decaying oil refineries or build the Tehran metro system due to sanctions, massive Chinese conglomerates happily stepped in to fill the void.
And this relationship was formalized and massively expanded in 2013 when Chinese President Xi Jinping unveiled the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
This is a multi-trillion-dollar global infrastructure and investment strategy designed to recreate the ancient Silk Road, physically and digitally linking the economies of Asia, Africa, and Europe directly back to Beijing.
When you look at a map, Iran's geographic location is the absolute, unavoidable linchpin for the overland route bridging Central Asia to the Middle East and Europe.
China views a stable, compliant Iran as a critical node in its grand strategy for global economic dominance.
But we must critically evaluate the true nature of this partnership. Is China actually a loyal friend to Iran? Or are they just a ruthless bargain hunter exploiting a sanctioned country that has nowhere else to shop?
The rhetoric from Beijing and Tehran often highlights a comprehensive strategic partnership, emphasizing solidarity against American hegemony. But the operational reality analyzed in the source texts paints a much darker picture of exploitation.
Because Chinese corporations know that Western, Japanese, and South Korean competitors are legally barred from bidding on Iranian contracts due to U.S. Treasury sanctions,
So they operate as a de facto monopoly inside the country.
which removes any incentive for competitive pricing or quality control. If you have a monopoly, you don't have to offer your best product.
The research highlights severe frustrations within the Iranian business community regarding Chinese economic practices. Chinese firms have developed a notorious reputation in Iran for ruthlessly overcharging for services, delivering subpar, low-quality engineering, and engaging in massive, inexplicable project delays.
The frustration with this exploitation has repeatedly breached the surface of diplomatic pleasantries. In one highly publicized incident, the Iranian government became so exasperated with the glacial pace and poor performance of the China National Petroleum Corporation, the CNPC, in developing the massive South Pars gas field that Tehran actually canceled a $2.5 billion contract.
It was a rare, desperate assertion of sovereignty against their only economic lifeline.
But the ultimate proof that China operates purely in its own self-interest rather than as a loyal ally to the Islamic Republic is found in its compliance with international pressure.
Despite all the rhetoric about opposing American imperialism, when the U.S. and the EU enacted the draconian financial sanctions and the SWIFT ban in 2012, China did not try to bust the sanctions to save the Iranian economy.
They quietly complied. They actively reduced their imports of Iranian crude to secure waivers from the U.S. State Department.
Beijing coldly calculated that protecting its trillion-dollar trade relationships with the United States and the European Union was vastly more important than protecting the Iranian economy.
They will throw Tehran a life preserver to keep it from drowning, but they will charge a premium for the rope, and they will absolutely not pull them into the boat if it means upsetting Washington.
So we have charted a profoundly cynical map. Russia provides military coordination based on ruthless strategic necessity, completely willing to betray Iranian interests to appease Israel or Saudi Arabia.
China provides an economic lifeline, but utilizes its monopolistic position to exploit the Iranian market while bowing to Western sanctions.
This leaves a massive diplomatic, economic, and ideological void. And surprisingly, the entity that has consistently attempted to fill that void, utilizing a completely different geopolitical philosophy, is the European Union.
The EU's approach to the Islamic Republic is fascinating because it operates on a fundamentally different paradigm than the American strategy of maximum pressure and isolation.
To understand this, we have to recognize that the EU, as an institution, does not carry the same historical baggage of mutual enmity with the post-1979 regime.
Now, individual member states have certainly had severe diplomatic crises. The United Kingdom severed ties for years following the fatwa issued against author Salman Rushdie, and European courts have aggressively prosecuted Iranian intelligence agents for assassinating dissidents on European soil.
But the overarching foreign policy philosophy of the Brussels bureaucracy is built on the concept of effective multilateralism. They inherently believe that diplomacy, international law, and constructive engagement are vastly superior tools for modifying state behavior than embargoes and threats of military force.
This European philosophy is not born of naive altruism. It is driven by immediate, intense overlapping interests and the unforgiving reality of geography.
Consider the geographic proximity. The United States is protected by two vast oceans. It can afford to view the Middle East as a distant chessboard.
The European Union shares a direct, porous border with the fallout of Middle Eastern instability.
The catastrophic Syrian civil war triggered the largest refugee crisis since World War II, sending millions of desperate people fleeing across the Mediterranean and the Balkans into Europe.
This influx caused profound socioeconomic strain, fractured European political unity, and fueled the rise of far-right nationalist parties.
Consequently, maintaining the stability of the Iranian state, a massive nation of 80 million people, is viewed in Brussels not as an abstract foreign policy goal, but as a critical, urgent domestic security imperative.
A collapsed, chaotic Iran would trigger a refugee wave that could fundamentally break the European Union's social fabric.
Beyond the threat of mass migration, there's the immediate threat of terrorism. While Washington views Iran's proxies as the primary terrorist threat, the European experience has been entirely different.
European cities, Paris, Brussels, Nice, have suffered horrific mass casualty terrorist attacks perpetrated by ISIS and its radical Sunni affiliates.
EU leadership, including figures like former High Representative Federica Mogherini, have publicly and explicitly stated that Europe requires a stable Iran as a functional partner in the intelligence and military effort to combat Sunni extremism and stabilize the Levant.
And then there's the massive, unavoidable factor of economics and energy security. Prior to the imposition of the severe multilateral sanctions in 2012, the European Union was historically Iran's largest trading partner.
By 2008, bilateral trade had peaked at roughly 27 billion euros. European manufacturing, heavy industry, and automotive sectors view Iran's highly educated, young, consumer-hungry middle class as a massive, largely untapped market.
Furthermore, Europe is chronically dependent on imported energy. For decades, the EU has desperately sought to diversify its energy supply chains to reduce its dangerous strategic reliance on natural gas imports from the Russian Federation.
Iranian energy reserves, some of the largest on the planet, offer the perfect long-term alternative to break the Russian monopoly.
This dynamic creates what looks like a classic good cop, bad cop routine on a global scale.
The United States aggressively plays the bad cop, deploying aircraft carriers to the Persian Gulf, threatening military strikes, enforcing secondary sanctions, and using apocalyptic rhetoric.
Meanwhile, the European Union plays the good cop, keeping embassies open, offering mechanisms for comprehensive dialogue, structuring humanitarian trade channels, and constantly pushing for negotiated settlements.
The underlying European theory of change is that if you engage Iran economically and socially, you empower the moderate, reformist, technocratic factions within the Iranian government.
By integrating them into the global economy, you give them a tangible stake in the international order.
Conversely, the EU argues that the American strategy of isolation and starvation achieves nothing but handing absolute power and domestic legitimacy directly to the most radical hardline elements of the IRGC.
It is vital to note that this European commitment to engagement has its limits. When the evidence regarding the military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program became undeniable in 2012, the EU made the agonizing decision to join the American-led sanctions regime, recognizing that a nuclear-armed Iran posed a greater threat to global stability than a severed trade relationship.
However, even while enforcing those sanctions, the European diplomatic corps was the indispensable engine that kept the back channels open. They provided the diplomatic scaffolding that ultimately birthed the JCPOA.
But wait, we have to look analytically at the outcome of that European strategy. If the EU's ultimate goal was to empower the moderate factions inside Iran through trade and engagement, didn't their eventual capitulation to the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign entirely undermine their own philosophy?
When the U.S. withdrew from the deal and threatened secondary sanctions, European multinational corporations instantly abandoned the Iranian market.
The EU governments tried to set up alternative financial mechanisms like Instex to bypass U.S. sanctions, but they were utterly ineffective. So, by failing to protect the trade agreements they negotiated, didn't Europe essentially prove the Iranian hardliners right? They starved the very moderates they claimed to be empowering.
That is the tragic paradox of the European position. Their diplomatic ambitions were completely neutralized by their financial vulnerability. The sheer size and structural dominance of the U.S. dollar and the American financial system meant that European companies would always choose access to Wall Street over access to Tehran.
The failure of the EU to deliver on the economic promises of the JCPOA devastated the credibility of the moderate Iranian factions who championed the deal, virtually guaranteeing the resurgence of hardline, anti-Western leadership in subsequent Iranian elections.
So as we pull back the lens and survey this massive, complex geopolitical chessboard we have meticulously detailed today, a stark, undeniable pattern emerges.
It is a story of continuous action and reaction.
The ultimate takeaway for you listening to this analysis is that Iran's multi-directional foreign policy is not an erratic, irrational project. It is a highly calculated, desperate survival mechanism utilized by a state under siege.
They are engaged in a relentless ideological wrestling match with the United States to maintain their domestic legitimacy.
They are aligning with a deeply untrustworthy, historically hostile Russia to secure their military flanks in places like Syria.
They are enduring economic exploitation by an opportunistic China to keep their domestic economy on life support.
And they're endlessly negotiating with a well-intentioned but financially impotent European Union to keep a diplomatic foot wedged in the door of the international community.
But every single one of these complex maneuvers is a direct reaction to the immense, inescapable gravitational pull of United States containment policy.
And that leads us to a final, incredibly provocative thought to leave you with. A strategic question to ponder long after this deep dive ends.
The source material we've unpacked makes it abundantly clear that decades of U.S. sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and financial weaponization are precisely the forces that drove Tehran out of the Western orbit and directly into the waiting arms of Moscow and Beijing.
Consider the long-term global implications of that dynamic. If the ultimate stated goal of U.S. policy over the last 40 years was to isolate Iran in order to weaken the regime and force a change in its behavior, what happens if that very pressure ends up having the exact opposite effect?
What if the relentless pressure of containment permanently cements an impenetrable strategic axis between Russia, China, and Iran?
Could the policy of isolation inadvertently be forging a massive, self-sustaining Eastern bloc? A bloc that actively builds its own alternative financial systems to bypass SWIFT, shares its own advanced military technology, dominates the Eurasian energy market, and eventually reaches a point where it no longer needs Western engagement, investment, or approval at all.
It would be the ultimate world-altering unintended consequence. The very gravity designed to hold a nation in check, violently pushing it into an entirely new, hostile orbit.
The data supports that trajectory.
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The geopolitical landscape is dense, it is often contradictory, and it is rarely what it appears to be on the surface. But taking the time to look past the rhetoric, to understand the history, the mechanics, and the underlying motivations is how we actually start to understand the board.
Keep questioning the narratives, keep analyzing the moves, and we will catch you next time. You know, when you look at one of those classic optical illusions like that vintage drawing that's either a rabbit or a duck, your brain usually just locks onto one image right away. It's totally binary.
Yeah.
Like you see the duck, and to you, it's just a duck.
Yeah, it actually feels almost physically impossible to see the rabbit until you actively, force your perspective to shift. You have to completely rewire how you're interpreting the lines and the shading on the page.
Right, exactly. And, that is pretty much the perfect way to describe the experience of trying to understand the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, specifically when we look at Iran.
Oh, absolutely.
Because for a lot of you listening, the curious minds who really want to get beyond that loud, chaotic 24-hour news cycle, you probably have one locked-in image of what Iran's regional relations look like.
Right, which is completely understandable.
Yeah, I mean, it's usually painted in very broad, very intense strokes. It's ideological, it's uncompromising. But today, our mission for this deep dive is to basically force that perspective shift. We're going to peel back the layers and look at the intricate and honestly sometimes totally contradictory drivers of Iran's foreign policy.
And we have an incredibly detailed roadmap for this today. We're drawing from this exhaustive policy research that meticulously maps out Iran's strategic maneuvering.
Which is a lot to get through, honestly.
It is a lot. It breaks down their internal political clashes, and it details their incredibly complex relationships, not just in the Middle East, but stretching all the way across Central Asia and the Caucasus.
Yeah.
It's this dense web, but it provides so much clarity to what otherwise just looks like an unsolvable maze. And I think it's really important to state right up front how we're approaching this.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Yeah, because the documents we are unpacking today cover intense, deeply entrenched rivalries, most notably, the Saudi-Iranian conflict. And these involve severe sectarian divides and proxy wars that have devastating real-world consequences for literally millions of people.
Right. I mean, the stakes are incredibly high, and the human cost is very, very real.
Which is exactly why our goal today is to step back and just look at the bare mechanics. We aren't here to take a side, or validate any specific political narrative or endorse any government's rhetoric.
No, not at all.
We just want to lay out the geopolitical chessboard exactly as the research describes it. We're looking at the pieces, how they move, and crucially why they move, so that you can see all the angles and draw your own informed conclusions.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because right out of the gate, the research drops this massive, counterintuitive bombshell.
It really does.
I mean, the prevailing image of Iran in the West is that of a rigid ideological crusader, right? A theocracy relentlessly pursuing this religious mission at all costs. But the data reveals that Iran's foreign policy is actually rooted in a deeply pragmatic, almost cold-blooded survival strategy.
Yeah, a strategy that sometimes sees them allying with secular dictatorships, Christian nations, and even their former mortal enemies.
Which just sounds wild when you first hear it.
Yeah.
So break that down for us.
Well, the foundation of everything Iran does abroad is actually entirely about what is happening at home.
Okay.
The ultimate overarching priorities are preserving the regime itself and building a regional security architecture that keeps that regime safe from external collapse.
So wait, if the popular perception is that they're trying to aggressively take over the region, you're saying it's actually an entirely defensive posture.
Exactly. And to understand that, you really have to rewind to the 1979 revolution. Initially, yes, the rhetoric from the ruling clerics was very aggressive. It was all about, quote, exporting the revolution, unquote.
Right, to gain regional support.
Exactly. They wanted to topple neighboring monarchies. But that ideological fervor hit this brutal, unyielding wall of reality almost immediately, which was the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
Wow, yeah. And that was an unimaginably devastating conflict. I remember we're talking trench warfare, chemical weapons.
Yeah, 1 million casualties. It completely traumatized the Iranian leadership. It deepened Tehran's perception that they were perpetually under threat, entirely isolated, and literally surrounded by enemies backed by global superpowers.
Right, because the U.S. and other powers were supporting Iraq at the time.
Exactly. So they quietly downplayed that aggressive export the revolution idea. They shifted to a highly defensive posture, but, they knew they couldn't compete dollar for dollar or tank for tank with larger, technologically superior forces.
Like the United States, obviously.
Yep.
Or even a heavily armed neighbor.
Right. You can't win a conventional war when you are largely isolated from global arms market.
Which they were.
Exactly. So they developed what we call an asymmetric military posture. The logic is simple but ruthless. You make any invasion by a superior force so costly, so incredibly painful that it deters the attack in the first place.
So you don't fight them head on.
Right. You don't need a massive state-of-the-art air force if you can just bog your enemy down in 1,000 tiny, unwinnable proxy conflicts.
Okay, I want to try to make this internal dynamic a bit more concrete for the listener, because reading through the analysis of how Iranian foreign policy is actually made, it honestly sounded like madness. I kept picturing like a driver's education car, you know the ones,
Yeah.
with 2 separate steering wheels and 2 sets of pedals.
Oh, that is a brilliant way to visualize it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Iran's dual governance system is built on these separate and very often conflicting centers of power.
Right, so let me flesh out the car analogy a bit. You've got the elected president in the driver's seat. He's got his hands on the wheel, his foot on the gas, trying to navigate the car down the normal road of international diplomacy.
Yeah.
But sitting right next to him, in the passenger seat, is the driving instructor, in this case, the supreme leader. And he also has a steering wheel. He has an override brake pedal. and he essentially represents pure revolutionary ideology.
That's incredibly accurate. And the instructor in your analogy, the supreme leader, is constitutionally the ultimate arbiter of literally everything.
He has the final say.
Absolutely. He can declare war, make peace, dismiss elected governments, and he vets all significant policies. Because the regime's domestic political legitimacy depends entirely on its fidelity to revolutionary ideology, all policy has to stay within the boundaries of Islamic discourse.
And he's not making these decisions alone in a room either. He has a massive apparatus behind him, right?
Yes, the Beta Rabari, or the leader's office. This is the ideological center of gravity. His key advisors heavily influence that override brake pedal.
So who are we talking about here?
You have figures deeply tied to the conservative establishment. You have military and security advisors from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and even an entire foreign relations arm operating directly out of the leader's office.
Wow.
Yeah. This side of the car basically represents the sovereignty of God.
But then you have the driver representing the sovereignty of the people.
Right.
The elected government.
Centered around the President and the Supreme National Security Council, or the SNSC. This council includes the Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Intelligence, the Interior, and the military chiefs.
Okay.
Now, while their decisions still require the Supreme Leader's final confirmation, the SNSC tends to lean heavily toward pragmatism. They are the ones actually looking at the crashing economy, the massive inflation rates, and the international isolation, and saying, hey, we need to make some deals here.
Which creates an incredible whiplash for anyone trying to actually negotiate with them.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the research highlights the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, as like the ultimate example of this dual brain system in action. You had the supreme leader endorsing this massive diplomatic agreement with the West to lift sanctions and save the Iranian economy. That is pure, desperate pragmatism.
Exactly.
But simultaneously, from the very same office, he's aggressively urging regional resistance against the United States. He's labeling them this hegemonic, totally distrusted power. It's like one foot is slamming the gas of diplomacy and the other foot is stomping on the ideological brake.
Yeah, and it's a concept deeply embedded in their political philosophy. It's often referred to as a jihadi-ijtihadi approach.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener, because that sounds like some heavy political science jargon.
Fair enough. So jihadi in this specific context refers to the revolutionary resistance side, standing firm against Western imperialism, absolutely refusing to compromise on core principles.
Got it. And the other half?
Ijtihadi refers to independent reasoning in Islamic law. It implies the flexibility to adapt to modern realities. So a jihadi-ijtihadi approach is this constant, tension-filled attempt to balance revolutionary resistance with pragmatic compromise.
It's like trying to be a revolutionary cause and a normal functioning nation state at the exact same time.
Exactly. And depending on which driver is exerting more influence at any given moment, Iran's foreign policy will look completely different to the outside world.
So we have this reactive dual-brain system driven by a deep fear of invasion and a desperate desire for regime survival. And you know, if you were sitting in Tehran right around the turn of the century, looking at a map of your neighborhood, you were about to experience the biggest geopolitical earthquakes imaginable.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the Western Front.
Yeah. To understand Iran's posture in the West, we have to look at the unintended consequences of American foreign policy.
Right.
Because the events of the early 21st century inadvertently handed Iran some of the greatest strategic opportunities in its modern history.
You're talking about the U.S. interventions right after 9/11.
Exactly. The U.S. campaign in Afghanistan in 2001 decimated the Taliban. 2 years later, the U.S. invasion of Iraq removed Saddam Hussein. So, in one sweeping motion, the United States essentially eliminated Iran's two greatest regional nightmares on its eastern and western borders.
But, I mean, if I'm understanding the Iranian mindset here, they weren't exactly throwing a party in Tehran over this.
Oh, no. It was terrifying for them. Yes, their hostile neighbors were gone. But suddenly there were hundreds of thousands of U.S. and coalition troops sitting directly on two of Iran's borders.
Just put yourself in their shoes for a second. You look out your left window, there's the U.S. military. You look out your right window, there's the U.S. military. And the rhetoric out of Washington at the time was literally grouping Iran into an axis of evil.
Right. President Bush's famous speech.
Yeah. The fear of encirclement, the fear that Iran was literally next on the regime change list, it was absolute.
And this fear triggered a masterful, albeit incredibly ruthless, response in Iraq. because the U.S. invasion turned Iraq from a strong, hostile, dictatorial state into a weak, fractured, chaotic power vacuum.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Exactly. Iran looked at that vacuum and adopted two simultaneous goals: preventative and promotional.
Okay, explain the mechanics of the preventative side first, because this is where the hard power really comes in.
The preventative goal was simple: stop the United States from stabilizing Iraq and using it as a launching pad to invade Iran.
Make it too costly.
Right, because the U.S. struggled with a coherent post-invasion strategy. Chaos reigned, and Iran actively exploited it. They reactivated covert networks they had built during the Iran-Iraq War. They funded, equipped, and trained Shia militias like the Badr Corps and the Mehdi Army.
And the research attributes a horrifying statistic to this specific strategy.
It does. Iran's elite unconventional warfare unit, the Quds Force, provided advanced weapons, specifically things like explosively formed penetrators, or EFPs.
And those are designed to rip right through heavy armor, right?
Yeah, they melt through Humvee armor like butter. These weapons, and the militias trained to use them, were responsible for an estimated 20% of all U.S. combat deaths in Iraq.
Wow. I mean, that is the ultimate asymmetric play. You don't fight the American military head-on. You bleed them in the streets of a third country using proxies, so they lose the political will to ever even think about crossing your border.
Precisely. That's the preventative goal: bleed the occupier. But, while the Quds Force is running that lethal hard power campaign, the pragmatic driver of the Iranian car, the elected government, is executing a massive soft power offensive.
The promotional goal.
Yes.
This is what really blew my mind reading the sources, because we hear so much about the militias in the news, but we rarely hear about the economics.
Well, Iraq has a roughly 60% Shia majority. Many prominent Iraqi Shia politicians and clerics had actually lived in exile in Iran during Saddam Hussein's reign.
Ah, so they already had the relationships.
Exactly. Iran capitalized on these deep pre-existing networks. They flooded the zone with diplomacy and trade.
And the numbers are just staggering. They became Iraq's largest trading partner. The data notes that trade volume hit $12 billion by 2015.
Right. And it wasn't just high-level abstract state contracts. It was everything. If you went to a market in Basra or Baghdad, you were buying cheap Iranian dairy, Iranian construction materials, Iranian cars.
They signed over 100 cooperation agreements, right, covering taxation, customs, border transit.
Yeah, and they aggressively targeted religious soft power, too.
Tell me about that, because that's fascinating.
They invested millions in infrastructure and religious tourism. They pumped over $13 million into renovating the massive holy Shia shrines in Najaf and Karbala.
Wow.
So just look at the dual track here: arming militias to fight the U.S. while simultaneously rebuilding religious sites and flooding the Iraqi market with affordable goods.
It's brilliant in a very dark way.
It is. When the U.S. ultimately withdrew its main combat forces in 2011, they left behind a Shia-dominated, highly pro-Iranian government in Baghdad. From Tehran's perspective, it was a total victory.
It's an incredible pivot. They literally turned an existential threat into a client state. But I want to move from Iraq over to Syria, because the analysis clears up a massive misconception that I think a lot of people hold.
This is a big one.
Yeah, if you watch the news, the conflict in the Middle East is almost exclusively framed as a Sunni versus Shia religious war. And Iran's backing of the Syrian government is usually lumped right into that religious crusade narrative. But the evidence explicitly states that the Iran-Syria alliance is not sectarian at all.
Right. This is a vital point that completely changes how you view the region. The alliance between Tehran and Damascus is entirely strategic. It is not religious. The Assad regime in Syria is a secular Ba'athist government.
Okay, stop there for a second. Define Ba'athist for the listener.
Ba'athism is a political ideology promoting Arab nationalism, socialism, and secularism. It is fundamentally ideologically opposed to the idea of a religious theocracy.
Which is exactly what Iran is.
Exactly. Bashar al-Assad is not an Ayatollah. He runs a secular state. Now, yes, the Assad clan belongs to the Alawite sect, which is a distant offshoot of Shia Islam, but they only make up about 12% of Syria's population.
And historically, didn't traditional Shia clerics not even recognize Alawites as legitimate Muslims?
That's true. It wasn't until a political fatwa in the 1970s that they were officially recognized.
So, if it's not about religious brotherhood, why does Iran bleed itself dry to keep Assad in power?
Geography and history. Historically, Syria was one of the very few Arab states that supported Iran during the brutal Iran-Iraq War. While the rest of the Arab world backed Saddam, Syria stood with Tehran.
A debt of gratitude, basically.
Part of it. But more importantly today, Syria is the anchor. It provides Iran with a vital physical land bridge to Lebanon.
And Lebanon is home to Hezbollah.
Exactly. Hezbollah is Iran's most successful, most powerful proxy force. But you can't arm Hezbollah without a supply line. The weapons fly into Damascus and then they are trucked across the border into Lebanon.
Okay, so Syria also gives Iran strategic access to the Mediterranean Sea.
Right. If Assad falls, that supply line is severed, Hezbollah is isolated, and Iran's entire projection of power against Israel evaporates.
So when the Arab Spring uprisings kicked off in 2011, and millions of Syrians took to the streets demanding democratic reforms, Iran didn't see a popular organic uprising. They saw a strategic catastrophe unfolding.
They immediately framed the Sunni-led opposition as foreign-backed extremism and terrorism.
Yeah.
And they offered Assad absolutely unqualified, bottomless backing.
And the cost of that backing is almost incomprehensible. The economic data shows Iran was dumping an estimated $6 billion annually into Syria since 2011. They opened a $3.6 billion line of credit in 2013 just to keep the Syrian central bank from collapsing.
And the human cost is severe, too. They didn't just send money. Iran deployed high-ranking Quds Force generals, several of whom were actually killed in combat.
Which is a massive blow to their leadership.
Huge. And because they didn't want to send regular Iranian army troops and risk a massive domestic backlash back home, they recruited heavily. They built a literal proxy army, recruiting thousands of impoverished Shia volunteers from places like Afghanistan and Pakistan to go fight and die in Syria on Assad's behalf.
Let's shift further south to Yemen. Because if Syria is an example of Iran hemorrhaging money and lives to protect a strategic asset, Yemen is the exact opposite. Yemen is where Iran gets arguably the highest return on investment in the entire region.
Oh, without a doubt. Yemen is the absolute extreme of the low-cost, asymmetric war strategy. Following the instability of the Arab uprisings, Iran threw its support behind the Houthis.
And again, just to clarify for the listener, the Houthis are a Zaidi Shia insurgent group. They had been fighting the Yemeni central government for years, specifically opposing foreign interference, primarily from Saudi Arabia.
Right, and here is where the alliances get incredibly messy. The Houthis were eventually backed by Yemen's former dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Yeah, the irony here is that Saleh had previously been heavily supported by both Saudi Arabia and the United States for decades before he was ousted.
Talk about a revolving door of alliances.
Yeah.
But for Iran, getting involved with the Houthis was just a geopolitical masterstroke on the cheap.
Exactly. With relatively minimal assistance, I mean, we're talking about advising on military organization, providing some weapons components, and sharing drone technology. With just that, Iran empowered an insurgent group that managed to sweep out of the mountains and seize the capital city, Sana'a, in 2014.
And the secondary effect of that is the real prize for Tehran.
Yes. The Houthi takeover triggered absolute panic in Riyadh.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia intervened militarily to roll back the Houthis, and suddenly Iran's arch-rival is dragged into a protracted, exhausting, financially draining quagmire right on their own southern border.
We'll talk more about the toll on Saudi Arabia later, but just think about the mechanics of this for a second. Iran spends a few $1 million smuggling drone parts into Yemen. The Houthis assemble those drones and fly them into Saudi oil infrastructure. The Saudis then have to fire a $2 million Patriot missile to shoot down a $10,000 drone. It is literally an economic bleeding strategy.
It's the very definition of asymmetric warfare.
Okay, so if we look at this Western front, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Iran's actions seem highly ideological, aggressive, and deeply entwined with Shia militia networks.
Right.
And if you assume that's just how Iran operates, you'd expect them to be running the exact same militant playbook on their eastern borders. But if we turn our attention 180 degrees and look east, they operate with a playbook that is so radically different, it almost feels like a different country.
The East is where the pragmatic driver of the Iranian policy car takes almost total control. Here, we see revolutionary ideology tossed out the window in favor of cold, hard, economic and security realities.
Let's start with Afghanistan. The analysis lays out Iran's dual goals here: foster stability to protect the Shia and Persian-speaking minorities from persecution, while simultaneously preventing the U.S. from establishing a permanent foothold.
And surprisingly, their initial approach post-2001 wasn't to fund insurgencies against the new government. It was massive economic integration.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Remember, Iran actively helped the United Nations with the post-Taliban political settlement. They sat at the table and helped draft the new Afghan constitution.
They actually pledged over $500 million at the 2002 Tokyo Donor Conference for Afghan reconstruction. They built infrastructure, schools, health clinics, specifically focusing on the western provinces of Afghanistan that border Iran.
They essentially wove Western Afghanistan into the Iranian economy. They supplied the electricity, they supplied the fuel, they became Afghanistan's largest trading partner. And they embarked on a massive geostrategic infrastructural play, the Chabahar Port Project.
Okay, explain the mechanics of that because it's a huge deal for global trade and it's super interesting.
Chabahar is a port in southeastern Iran, right on the Gulf of Oman. India invested heavily in developing this port. Why? Because India wants to trade with Afghanistan and Central Asia, but their arch rival, Pakistan, sits right in between them and blocks land access.
So India ships goods to the Iranian port of Chabahar, and then it goes by road up into Afghanistan.
Exactly. And Iran funded a massive road network to link the port directly to the Afghan border. It allows Afghanistan to completely bypass Pakistan for trade, which reduces Pakistani leverage, boosts the Iranian economy, and anchors Indian interests right in Iran. It's brilliant economic statecraft.
Well, wait. I have to stop here because the research points out something that feels like a total glitch in the matrix.
Okay, what's that?
It says that post-2016, Iran actively engaged in talks with the Taliban. They even hosted the Taliban leader, Mullah Mansour, in Iran right before he was killed by a U.S. drone.
Yeah.
Am I crazy? Or weren't the Taliban and Iran mortal enemies? Like, the Taliban are radical Sunni fundamentalists who murdered Iranian diplomats and almost went to war with Shia Iran in the late 90s.
You aren't crazy at all. They were bitter enemies. The prospect of Iran hosting Taliban leadership would have been unthinkable a decade prior.
So what changed?
Well, this raises an important point about how quickly geopolitical facts on the ground can force a rewrite of your foreign policy. Why did Iran engage the Taliban? Two very specific reasons.
I'm guessing the first one is the rise of ISIS.
Yes, when ISIS established a franchise in Afghanistan, known as ISIS-K, Tehran viewed them as a far more dangerous, unpredictable, and aggressively anti-Shia threat than the Taliban, and who is actively fighting ISIS in Afghanistan.
The Taliban.
The Taliban. So the enemy of my enemy is a highly useful tool.
Exactly. The second reason goes back to their primary fear, the United States. Iran feared that the U.S. bases in Afghanistan could be used to launch airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. By keeping lines of communication open with the Taliban and allegedly even providing them with some logistical support, Iran essentially bought themselves an insurance policy.
Wow.
Yeah, they created leverage against the U.S., ensured the Americans were kept busy, and guaranteed that Iran would have a seat at the table in whatever post-NATO political future emerged in Kabul.
That is just pure realpolitik.
Okay.
But the East isn't just about high-level 3D chess. The evidence details severe, terrifyingly real crises that Iran is dealing with along this border. It's not all ports and diplomacy.
No, not at all.
The first major crisis is water.
The Helmand River dispute, this is an existential resource crisis. Iran's eastern Sistan-Baluchistan province is incredibly arid. It is heavily dependent on water flowing in from the Helmand River, which originates in Afghanistan.
Right.
There is a treaty from 1973 regarding water rights, but due to decades of war, it has never been fully implemented.
And when you mess with water in a desert region, the human consequences are immediate.
Oh, catastrophic. When a severe drought hit in the early 2000s, the river dried up. The wetlands turned into dust bowls. The research notes that over 120 villages in eastern Iran were simply abandoned.
Just picture that. 120 entire communities packing up whatever they can carry and just walking away because the earth literally dried up beneath them.
Right.
That creates a massive wave of internal climate refugees that the Iranian government has to manage.
And now, Afghanistan is planning to build dozens of new dams along the river to secure its own agricultural needs. For Tehran, this isn't just a diplomatic spat, it's a domestic survival issue.
But an even bigger crisis, and one that completely blew me away when I read the numbers, is drugs.
Yeah, the scale of the drug trafficking problem is staggering, and it heavily dictates Iran's border policy. Afghanistan produces roughly 80% of the world's illicit opium. And to get that product to lucrative markets in Europe and the Gulf, smugglers use Iran as their primary transit corridor.
How much are we actually talking about here?
Iran seizes 75% of the global opium supply. Just let that sink in. They seize 61% of the world's morphine and 17% of its heroin.
Wow. And if you're wondering what it actually takes to seize that much narcotics, we are not talking about customs agents with sniffer dogs here.
No.
We are talking about a full-scale militarization of a desert border.
The Iranian government has spent billions digging massive trenches, building concrete walls, and deploying tens of thousands of security personnel.
Because the smugglers are basically an army.
They are. They're not small-time criminals. They are heavily armed cartels operating with night vision goggles, anti-aircraft guns, and armored convoys. Thousands of Iranian border guards have been killed in shootouts over the decades.
And despite all that blood and money, millions of tons of drugs still get through, and a lot of it stays inside Iran.
That is the truly tragic domestic toll. Because the transit routes run right through Iranian cities, the local population is heavily exposed. The data estimates there are between 2 and 6 million drug addicts currently inside Iran.
Out of a population of roughly 85 million, that is an absolute public health catastrophe.
It's a nightmare. It drains the economy, fills the prisons, and forces Iran to stay deeply, pragmatically involved in Afghan stability. They just cannot afford an uncontrolled collapse next door. Add to that the human element of displacement. There are an estimated 2.5 to 3 million Afghan refugees living in Iran.
And the research notes that Iran isn't above weaponizing those refugees either. When they need diplomatic leverage against Kabul, they have historically threatened to, or actually initiated, the forced repatriation of hundreds of thousands of Afghans, literally threatening to overwhelm the fragile Afghan economy.
Which brings us to the other neighbor on the eastern flank, Pakistan. Here, the relationship is defined by what we can basically call a severe nuclear trust deficit.
Because Pakistan is a nuclear-armed Sunni-majority state, and the documentation lists 4 very specific reasons why Tehran looks at Islamabad with deep, lingering suspicion.
First is Afghanistan. Pakistan's intelligence services have historically cultivated and used the Taliban and other radical Sunni groups to maintain strategic depth and influence in Kabul. That runs directly counter to Iran's desire for a stable, inclusive Afghanistan that protects Shia minorities.
Right. And second is the domestic situation inside Pakistan itself.
Yes. There is widespread institutional discrimination and frequent sectarian violence targeting Pakistan's own Shia minority. Since Tehran views itself as the protector of Shia populations globally, this is a constant source of friction.
Third is the Saudi connection.
Pakistan has a deeply entrenched strategic and financial relationship with Saudi Arabia. They have shared military exercises, and Saudi Arabia frequently bails out the Pakistani economy. So there is a lingering paranoid concern in Tehran that if push comes to shove, Saudi Arabia could potentially acquire tactical nuclear weapons from Pakistan to counter Iran.
Wow, that's a terrifying thought. And the fourth reason brings the threat directly onto Iranian soil.
The rise of Sunni insurgent groups in Iran's Sistan Baluchistan province. This province borders Pakistani Baluchistan. Groups like Jundallah, which carried out a horrific suicide bombing in 2010 that killed dozens of people, and Jaish al-Adl operate in this region. Tehran frequently alleges that these militant groups find sanctuary, recruitment hubs, and logistical support just across the border in Pakistan.
They suspect Islamabad is turning a blind eye.
Or worse, that Pakistan is actively complicit, possibly funded by Saudi or American intelligence. Islamabad vehemently denies this, obviously, but the suspicion completely paralyzes the relationship.
So if the West is an ideological proxy war battleground, and the East is a zone of harsh pragmatism over water, drugs, and border security, the northern border takes this geopolitical cognitive dissonance to an entirely new level. The ideological rulebook isn't just thrown out the window here, it's set on fire. Let's look at the northern neighbors.
The North is basically a masterclass in geostrategic compartmentalization.
Let's start with Turkey. Here you have 2 major, historically proud regional powers. They're on completely opposite sides of the bloodiest conflict in the region, the Syrian civil war. Turkey actively backs the Sunni opposition, trying to overthrow the government, while Iran is bleeding itself dry to keep Assad in power. Logically, you would expect them to be at each other's throats.
Yet they maintain a highly functional, often friendly working relationship. They literally fence off their geostrategic differences in Syria to focus on shared economic and security interests.
And those economic interests are massive. The data shows a $10 billion trade relationship. Iran supplies a quarter of Turkey's total energy imports.
But it goes much deeper than just selling gas. During the height of the international financial sanctions on Iran, when Iran was cut off from the global banking system, SWIFT, Turkey, helped them orchestrate a massive scheme to bypass those restrictions.
This is the famous gold for goods exchange.
Yeah.
Explain the mechanics of how you launder billions of dollars between nations.
It's fascinating. Iran is locked out of international banking, right? So they can't receive dollars or euros for the oil and gas they sell to Turkey. So Turkey pays for the energy using its own currency, the Turkish lira, depositing it into a Turkish state-owned bank account held by Iran.
But the lira isn't super useful for Iran to buy goods on the global market.
Exactly. So Iran takes those billions of lira sitting in the Turkish bank and uses them to buy massive amounts of physical gold inside Turkey.
Okay.
They then physically ship that gold, usually via couriers on commercial flights, to Dubai. In Dubai, the gold is sold for foreign currency, which is then quietly wired back into Iran or used to buy imports. It was a multi-billion-dollar loophole that kept the Iranian economy breathing, facilitated entirely by a country they were actively fighting a proxy war against in Syria.
I mean, that is the definition of compartmentalization.
They also share a critical security concern that binds them, preventing Kurdish independence. Both Turkey and Iran have large, historically restive Kurdish minority populations. Neither Ankara nor Tehran wants to see a breakaway Kurdish state emerge in Iraq or Syria because they know it would immediately inspire separatist movements within their own borders. That shared paranoia keeps their security forces perfectly aligned.
But the real mind bender in the north is the Caucasus. I want you, the listener, to just pause for a second. Try to guess something. You have two countries bordering Iran to the northwest, Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijan is a majority Shia Muslim nation. Armenia is a predominantly Christian nation. Knowing everything we've discussed about the Islamic Republic of Iran, a theocratic state that claims to be the global protector of Shia Muslims, which of these two countries do you think Iran considers a close strategic ally, and which one do they view as a severe security threat?
It's the ultimate trick question, because Iran has deeply strained, highly tense relations with its Shia neighbor, Azerbaijan, and they have very warm, strategic, supportive relations with Christian Armenia.
I mean, how is that logically possible?
It comes down to two powerful forces, ethnicity and security paranoia. First, the ethnic context. A massive swath of modern-day Azerbaijan was actually part of the Persian Empire for centuries until it was lost to Russia in a series of wars in the 1820s.
Wow, okay.
As a result of those borders being redrawn, there is an enormous ethnic Azeri population living inside modern-day Iran.
And the numbers are shocking. There are roughly 13 million ethnic Azeris living in northwestern Iran.
That is more than the entire population of the actual country of Azerbaijan.
Unbelievable.
And Tehran suffers from profound, lingering ethnic paranoia about this. They constantly worry about pan-Turkic nationalism. They fear that a strong, prosperous, independent Azerbaijan could inspire their massive domestic Azeri minority to demand autonomy, or worse, try to secede and unify with Baku.
The research mentions an incident in 2015 that illustrates exactly how fragile this is. A state-run children's television program in Iran aired a segment that just mildly mocked an Azeri accent.
Right.
And it sparked massive, widespread street protests across Iranian cities. I mean, it's an absolute powder keg.
So Iran approaches Azerbaijan with extreme caution. And on the political side, Azerbaijan does everything that annoys Tehran. It is a staunchly secular government. It views Turkey as its natural brotherly ally. But what truly sets off alarm bells in Tehran is Azerbaijan's incredibly close defense and intelligence ties with Israel.
Israel, the ultimate enemy of the Iranian state, operating right on their northern border.
The research cites a massive defense deal signed in 2012 worth $1.6 billion between Baku and Tel Aviv. Azerbaijan buys Israeli drones, anti-aircraft systems, and missile defense. In return, Azerbaijan supplies Israel with a huge portion of its oil.
Wow.
And for years, there have been persistent intelligence rumors that Azerbaijan might allow Israel to use its forward airfields for a potential preemptive military strike on Iranian nuclear facilities.
So feeling threatened by the Shia nation to the north, Iran looks for a counterbalance. And they find it in Armenia.
Yes. Armenia provides an essential access route for Iranian energy exports and trade into the broader Eurasian Economic Union, which is a massive regional market. They do hundreds of millions of dollars in bilateral trade.
And crucially, Armenia has a deeply adversarial relationship with both Turkey and Azerbaijan over historical grievances and the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region.
Exactly. For Tehran, Aligning with Christian Armenia is the perfect, pragmatic, geopolitical chess move to check the ambitions of Shia Azerbaijan and limit Turkish influence in the Caucasus. Religion doesn't even factor into the equation.
It's staggering. It really is. And just rounding out the north, we have a brief look at Turkmenistan.
Yes, Turkmenistan is the quiet gas partner. Their relationship is generally stable, built on mutual international isolation and shared interests in developing the massive hydrocarbon reserves in the Caspian Sea. Iran is Turkmenistan's only real overland connection to the Persian Gulf, and in return, Turkmenistan gives Iran a gateway into Central Asia. There are occasional hiccups, like a dispute in 2017 when Turkmenistan suddenly cut off gas supplies in the dead of winter, over $2 billion in unpaid Iranian debts.
Yikes.
But overall, it's a stable, purely transactional relationship.
Okay, let's pull back for a second and look at the map we just spent the last chunk of time drawing. Iran has built this incredibly intricate, totally contradictory web of relationships. They are ideological proxy warriors heavily invested in sectarian conflicts in the West. They are pragmatic merchants, dam builders, and Taliban negotiators in the East. And they are completely counterintuitive geopolitical compartmentalizers allying with Christians against Shias in the North.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But all of these threads, everywhere we look, inevitably crash into one massive, defining wall.
Saudi Arabia.
Yes, the arch rivalry. The divided Gulf. If you want to understand why gas prices fluctuate, why global supply chains jitter, or why there is so much human suffering in the region, you have to understand this rivalry.
And returning to our commitment to impartiality at the start of this deep dive, it is vital to understand exactly how Saudi Arabia views Iran's actions. Because if you sit in Riyadh looking at the exact same map we just drew, Iran's complex web of relations does not look like a defensive, pragmatic survival strategy.
What does it look like to them?
It looks like an aggressive, militant, expansionist march toward total regional domination.
The research quotes the former Saudi foreign minister, Adel al-Jubeir, stating flat out, quote, "Iran is the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the world." That is the baseline Saudi perspective.
From the Saudi perspective, they feel surrounded. They look north and see Iranian proxy militias controlling the government in Iraq. They see Iranian generals directing the war in Syria. They see Hezbollah dominating Lebanon. And they look south and see Iranian-backed Houthis firing ballistic missiles over the border from Yemen. They see a country pursuing a highly controversial nuclear program while actively subverting its Arab neighbors.
And the panic in Riyadh reached a total fever pitch during the Obama administration.
It did. Saudi Arabia felt the United States, their traditional security guarantor, was pivoting to Asia and disengaging from the Middle East. They fiercely opposed the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal.
Because they thought it would just enrich Iran.
Exactly. Riyadh argued that lifting sanctions would just flood Tehran with billions of dollars, which Iran would immediately pump into these proxy networks to destabilize the region further.
So feeling abandoned by the U.S. and surrounded by Iran, Saudi Arabia responded with raw, staggering financial power. Let's look at the military buildup, because the numbers here are hard to wrap your head around.
Saudi defense spending absolutely skyrocketed. It nearly doubled in just a few years, jumping from $68.5 billion in 2011 to $87.2 billion by 2015.
Just to put that in perspective for the listener, Saudi Arabia was spending 6 times what Iran was spending on defense.
They accounted for over half of the entire Middle East and North Africa's total defense expenditure. And what were they buying? They were buying the most advanced lethal technology on the planet. F-15 Strike Eagles, Apache helicopters, precision-guided munitions, advanced radar systems.
And that was before the massive $110 billion arms deal they signed with the U.S. in 2017. They became the world's second-largest arms importer.
But all those weapons couldn't buy them the one thing they really wanted, which was regional unity.
Right. Here's a fascinating detail from the analysis that shatters another common illusion. If you read Western media, we often think of the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, which includes Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar, as a unified, monolithic Arab bloc standing shoulder to shoulder against Iranian aggression. But the data says that is a complete illusion.
It absolutely is. Saudi Arabia desperately wanted a united, defiant GCC stance against Iran, complete with a unified military command structure to counter the Quds force. But it totally failed.
Why?
While the UAE and Bahrain give full backing to Riyadh's hardline approach, the other members simply don't share the same level of threat perception regarding Iran.
Let's look at Oman, for instance.
Oman is the Switzerland of the Gulf. They have maintained amiable, functional terms with Iran since the 1979 revolution. They share control of the Strait of Hormuz, the most critical oil choke point in the world, with Iran, so they practically have to get along.
Didn't they host some secret talks, too?
Yes. Oman even hosted the highly secret back-channel talks between the U.S. and Iran that eventually laid the groundwork for the nuclear deal. Kuwait and Qatar also consistently prefer diplomatic engagement and economic dialogue over military confrontation with Tehran.
And this internal fracture within the GCC spectacularly exploded into public view in 2017, the Qatar blockade.
Yes. In a stunning move, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt suddenly turned on Qatar. They accused Doha of funding terrorism and, crucially, of maintaining too close a working relationship with Iran.
Wow.
They severed all diplomatic relations, ordered their citizens to leave, and imposed a massive, suffocating land, air, and sea blockade.
Which, if you think about it from an Iranian perspective, is the greatest strategic gift imaginable.
It was incredible. While the U.S. scrambled to try to navigate the crisis, remember, Qatar hosts the Al Udeid Air Base, the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East. Iran and Turkey swooped in to save the day.
How do they bypass the blockade?
Well, Saudi Arabia closed the only land border Qatar has, cutting off all their food imports. So Iran immediately opened its airspace to Qatari flights. They launched an emergency airlift, sending hundreds of tons of fresh fruits, vegetables, and milk to Doha every single day.
That's wild.
The crisis essentially shattered the GCC as a united Arab front, driving Qatar closer to Tehran and playing right into Iran's hands.
But the rivalry between Riyadh and Tehran isn't just diplomatic squabbling over air rights. It is playing out in blood, most tragically in Yemen.
We mentioned Yemen earlier as an Iranian low-cost victory, but the human toll of the Saudi military response has been catastrophic. In 2015, Saudi Arabia launched Operation Decisive Storm.
What was the goal there?
They led an Arab coalition in a massive aerial bombing campaign to crush the Iranian-backed Houthis and restore the recognized government. They expected a quick, overwhelming victory using their vastly superior air power.
But you can't bomb an insurgency out of the mountains. It turned into a nightmare.
A protracted, devastating conflict. The research notes that by early 2016, Saudi Arabia had lost hundreds of soldiers and civilians to cross-border attacks. But the toll inside Yemen is just unimaginable. The UN estimated tens of thousands of deaths, with human rights groups attributing a majority of civilian casualties to coalition airstrikes hitting markets, hospitals, and weddings. The blockade on Yemeni ports displaced millions of people, pushed the country to the brink of famine, and triggered what was, at the time, the worst cholera outbreak in modern history.
And as the proxy wars intensified in places like Yemen and Syria, so did the deeply sectarian rhetoric. This rivalry isn't just fought with bombs, it's fought with religious legitimacy.
Both sides aggressively weaponized sectarian identity to rally their domestic bases. Saudi clerics publicly denounced Shias as heretics and Iranian agents. You had the Saudi Grand Mufti in 2016 making a public statement claiming Iran's leaders, quote, are not Muslims.
That is a massive statement to make.
Inside Saudi Arabia, the Shia minority, which makes up 10 to 15% of the population and lives primarily in the oil-rich eastern province, faces severe suppression because Riyadh inherently views them as a potential Iranian fifth column.
And that paranoia led to a massive, dangerous escalation in January 2016.
The execution of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr. He was a very popular, outspoken Saudi Shia cleric who was highly critical of the Saudi royal family's treatment of the Shia minority. He was not a violent militant, but Riyadh executed him on terrorism charges.
And the region just exploded.
His execution sparked outrage across the Shia world. In Iran, massive protests broke out. Mobs attacked the Saudi embassy in Tehran and the consulate in Mashhad, ransacking the buildings and setting them on fire with Molotov cocktails, while Iranian security forces largely just stood by.
Saudi Arabia immediately severed diplomatic relations.
They did, and the fallout continued right into the most sacred religious spheres. Following a horrific stampede at the Hajj pilgrimage in 2015 that killed over 2,400 people, including over 460 Iranians, Tehran viciously blamed Saudi incompetence and mismanagement.
Which escalated things even further.
They actually banned their own citizens from participating in the Hajj the following year. Ties plunged to their lowest, most dangerous point since the 1980s.
So, if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, Saudi Arabia paints Iran as this unstoppable master chess-playing juggernaut that is slowly, inevitably swallowing the Middle East. And looking at their influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, It's easy to buy into that narrative.
Sure.
But according to the deep analysis we are looking at, is that reality? Is Iran actually winning, or is this dual steering wheel car speeding toward a cliff, stretching itself to the absolute breaking point? That brings us to our reality check.
It's arguably the most critical part of our analysis today, because while Iran has undoubtedly expanded its geopolitical footprint over the last 2 decades, the costs have been astronomical, and the illusion of Iranian invincibility has been totally shattered.
Let's start with the reputation on the street level. The research details how Iran used to enjoy massive popularity across the Arab world, among both Sunnis and Shias.
They did. For a long time, their fiery revolutionary rhetoric, their strong anti-U.S. posture, their defiance of Israel, and their financial support for Palestinian militant groups made them highly popular on the, quote, Arab Stream. When the Arab Spring uprisings kicked off in 2011 and dictators were falling in Tunisia and Egypt, Iran initially cheered them on. They tried to co-opt the movement, branding it an Islamic awakening inspired by their own 1979 revolution.
But then the Arab Spring reached Syria.
Syria was the absolute turning point for Iran's regional image. When the popular uprisings reached Damascus and threatened their most important strategic ally, Assad, Iran completely changed its tune overnight.
Yeah, the champion of the oppressed suddenly offered unconditional, lethal support to a regime that was deploying chemical weapons, dropping barrel bombs on residential neighborhoods, and committing massive violence against its own people.
And the Arab world watched the hypocrisy play out in real time.
They watched, and the Islamic awakening narrative collapsed entirely. By unconditionally backing Assad's brutality, Iran eroded its own moral legitimacy. It revealed itself to the region as being just as willing to fuel sectarian divisions and support state repression as any of the imperialist powers it criticized. They lost the Arab Street, likely for a generation.
And it's not just the Sunni Arab world that turned against them. The concept of the Shia crescent, this terrified notion popular in Western think tanks, that Iran controls a contiguous, monolithic bloc of fiercely loyal Shia followers stretching from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean. The data says that is wildly overstated.
It is deeply overstated because it ignores the profound power of theology and local nationalism. You can't just group all Shias together and assume they blindly take orders from the supreme leader in Tehran.
Right.
Explain the theological rivalry here, because this goes back to the very foundation of how the religion is practiced. Najaf versus Qom.
Exactly. Qom is the religious center of Iran. This is where Ayatollah Khomeini developed the concept of velayat faqih, the rule by the Islamic jurist, the idea that a high-ranking cleric should not just advise the state, but hold absolute political power over it.
That is the basis of the Iranian government.
But Najaf in Iraq is a much older, historically more significant center of Shia theology. And the leading clerics in Najaf, most notably Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, practice a doctrine of quietism.
Meaning they don't think clerics should run the government.
Exactly. Sistani actively criticizes the Iranian model of governance. He believes clerics should guide the faithful spiritually, but stay out of the dirty business of day-to-day politics. He serves as a massive theological counterweight to Iranian influence.
And that high-level theological divide trickles all the way down to the general population. The polling data from Iraq is incredibly telling.
It destroys the myth of a unified Shia bloc. In a 2010 survey, 58% of Iraqi Shias held negative views of Iran's ties to their political elites. Only 18% viewed it positively.
Wow.
Fast forward to a 2015 survey, and 39% of Iraqi Shia respondents saw Iran actively as a factor of instability in their country.
We've literally seen Iraqi Shias burning down Iranian consulates in southern Iraq in recent years. They may share a religion, but they are Iraqi nationalists first, and they deeply resent Iranian political interference, corruption, and the flooding of their markets with cheap Iranian goods that kill local businesses.
The same dynamic exists in Afghanistan. The research notes Iran is wildly unpopular there, not just among the Sunni Pashtun majority, but even among non-Pashtuns and Afghan Shias, who are highly skeptical of Tehran's heavy-handed meddling and the poor treatment of Afghan refugees in Iran.
So the soft power is failing. But even more critically, the research highlights a hard geographic and military limit to Iran's hard power. The most sobering fact for Tehran is that their celebrated asymmetric strategy actually has a ceiling.
The defining reality of the modern Middle East is that Iran cannot prevail alone.
The document lays this out so clearly. Look at Iraq when ISIS swept across the country.
When ISIS captured Mosul and began marching toward Baghdad and the Shia holy cities, the Iraqi army basically collapsed. Iran rushed in to help. The Quds force arrived, they mobilized the militias, they sent weapons. But despite all of that asymmetrical power, Iran could not defeat ISIS on its own.
They didn't have the Air Force or the massive logistical capability.
No, they had to indirectly rely on the massive, sustained air power, intelligence sharing, and special operations assistance provided by the United States and the Western coalition to the Iraqi government to turn the tide.
Which is incredibly ironic.
Very. The U.S. bombed ISIS from the air, while Iranian-backed militias fought them on the ground. Iran literally needed its greatest enemy to save its most important client state.
And in Syria, the limits of their power were even more starkly exposed.
Despite the billions of dollars spent, the proxy armies mobilized, and the Iranian lives lost, by 2015, the Assad regime was on the verge of total collapse. The rebel forces were advancing on the capital. Iran was powerless to prevent it. They simply did not have the conventional military strength to turn the tide of a massive civil war.
So what did they do? The Quds force commander, Qasem Soleimani, supposedly flew to Moscow?
He did. Iran had to beg for a massive military intervention by Russia. It was Russian fighter jets, Russian bombers, and Russian naval power that ultimately saved Assad.
So their limits were laid bare.
Yes. Iran's geopolitical limits were put on plain display for the entire region to see. They can start fires and they can bog enemies down, but they cannot win conventional victories or stabilize regions without a great power bailing them out.
And that brings us to the final synthesis of what we've unpacked today. When we step back from the map and look at the entirety of the research, the picture of Iran that emerges is so much more nuanced, so much more fragile than the headlines suggest.
It really is.
Iran's foreign policy is not a monolith of revolutionary zeal marching toward a new Persian empire. It is a highly complex, desperately reactive survival strategy.
It's a country perpetually balancing the rigid ideological demands of a theocracy with the incredibly pragmatic necessities of a besieged nation-state. They balance brutal proxy wars in the West with vital trade partnerships in the East.
And they are driven by deep internal political divisions, historical trauma from the Iran-Iraq War, profound fears of American encirclement, and a desperate, overriding need to keep the homeland secure from external regime change.
They have managed to endure and exploit regional chaos remarkably well. They are masters at converting American debacles and regional power vacuums into Iranian opportunities, but they are stretched dangerously thin.
Yeah, they're facing severe existential domestic crises like water shortages and staggering drug epidemics. Their economy is battered, and they are managing a sprawling, highly expensive network of proxies in a region that increasingly resents their interference.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over, a question that builds on everything we've just discussed and challenges how we think about the future of the Middle East.
What's the question?
Throughout this deep dive, we've seen that Iran's entire regional posture, its asymmetric military doctrine, its reliance on proxy militias, its shifting contradictory alliances, has been meticulously built around one central concept: reacting to external threats and exploiting regional instability. They thrive in the gray zone of chaos.
So, if you remove the chaos,
Exactly. It forces us to ask a profound question. If the Middle East were to somehow actually achieve long-term stability, if the civil wars in Yemen and Syria ended, if foreign intervention ceased, and if Saudi Arabia and Iran normalized relations, what would happen to Tehran?
wow.
Would Iran's massive, expensive resistance model simply collapse under its own weight without an enemy to push against? Or would this deeply pragmatic, dual-brained state find a way to reinvent itself yet again and transition from a revolutionary cause back into a normal nation-state?
It's the ultimate optical illusion. Just when you think you've locked onto the image, the geopolitical lines shift again and you realize you have to rethink everything you just saw. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking beyond the headlines, keep questioning the simple narratives, and we'll see you next time.